Welcome to the Divine Identity Podcast. In this explainer, we're looking at Igor's article, When Succession Replaced Life, Polycarp, the Fathers, and the Early Shape of Catholic Authority. We're going to unpack a really fascinating historical and theological progression today. Specifically, we're looking at how the early church's entire understanding of authority fundamentally transformed in those generations immediately following the apostles.
Okay, let's dive into this. Today we're objectively unpacking how early Christianity kind of shifted its center of gravity away from life in Christ and toward institutional control. Our roadmap covers 1. The gospel authority question, 2. The signature of life, 3. The patristic institutional shift, 4. Catholicism in seed form, and finally, 5. Testing true succession.
So, starting off with Section 1, the gospel authority question.
The question of early church authority isn't just some dry historical debate. It's actually a fundamental gospel issue. We have to ask, does a chain of names actually guarantee a continuity of truth? The article points out the Catholic and high church arguments often rely really heavily on this chain of names, a succession from the apostles right down to later bishops. We're talking about men like Polycarp, Ignatius, Papias, and Irenaeus. The underlying logic here is basically that the institution inherited the true faith because the apostles taught disciples, and then those disciples became bishops. But Igor's article really challenges whether this is actually a safe assumption.
Because the author draws a really critical distinction here. A claimed chain of names is simply not the same thing as true continuity of apostolic doctrine. According to the article, geographic or chronological proximity to an apostle, like say living near John or knowing someone who knew him, proves very little if the person's teaching doesn't actually sound like John. The ultimate test of succession isn't about having a historical pedigree, it's about whether they actually preserved his core theological reality.
Let's move on to Section 2, the signature of life.
To properly test these historical figures, the article establishes a scriptural baseline by looking at the dual signatures of John and Paul. John's entire gospel states its purpose so clearly, that believing you may have life, and Paul really parallels this by centering his gospel on Christ and having life by the Spirit. And this brilliantly illustrates how both of them view obedience and holiness. They don't see it as some law-based requirement you have to do to earn life, but as a result that flows entirely from the living reality of Christ within the believer. That order is absolutely paramount.
The article really cements this idea with a crucial root versus fruit metaphor. In the pure apostolic grammar, life is the inward root, and it's given by God. Obedience, moral conduct, love, these are all the visible fruit that simply bear witness to that life. The author stresses a vital point here. Life always comes first, fruit comes second. That is the living center that absolutely must be preserved.
Right? Section 3, the patristic institutional shift.
So what happens when we compare that pure apostolic baseline to the very next generation of leaders? Well, a distinct theological shift begins to occur. The article states, Polycarp's surviving emphasis appears heavily weighted toward moral conduct, virtue, order, and proper religious behavior. Now, while Polycarp is definitely using Christian language, the author argues that his governing grammar fundamentally shifts the center of gravity. Instead of the new birth being the focus, it begins to sound a whole lot more like an external religion based on outward righteousness.
And Igor argues that Ignatius represents an even clearer move toward an institutional form of Christianity. While Ignatius does still use this really passionate language about life, the article notes that his language is increasingly being placed on institutional tracks. You start to see the bishop becoming the visible center of unity, rather than the living apostolic gospel itself. The article outlines how all of this eventually builds into what we can call a replacement logic. We start with the root in the apostolic age, right? But then authority subtly passes from apostle to bishop, then from bishop to successor, successor to the wider institution, and finally it lands on magisterial control in later eras. The text highlights a really specific danger here. Once this structural move is accepted, the institution eventually becomes the enforcer of truth, essentially replacing the living inward gospel with a mediated authority structure.
Which brings us to Section 4, Catholicism in seed form.
Now, as we explore what this patristic shift actually produced over the centuries, the article carefully nuances a really key point. It is absolutely not arguing that Polycarp or Ignatius sat down one day and personally invented the full medieval Catholic system. Not at all. Instead, it's that the operating principle of that system was planted early on, in seed form. The core argument here is that the very moment spiritual life became guarded by an office, the entire foundation shifted. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how starkly it contrasts these two competing systems. Look at this. Under the apostolic principle, authority is living truth, but under the institutional principle, it's recognized office. The center moves from life and spirit over to visible order. And perhaps most importantly, the author argues that obedience actually moves from being the joyful fruit of life to becoming the root, or the mechanism, for belonging. It basically transforms a religion of life into a machinery of control.
Of course, the article completely acknowledges the historical context here. These early communities were facing serious division and false teaching, which perfectly explains why they emphasized order so much. But as Igor points out, a crisis reveals what a system instinctually reaches for. Think about it. When Paul or John confronted a crisis, they immediately reached back to the spirit and to life. But the institutional crisis response, it reaches toward office, toward hierarchy, and enforced unity. The article frames this not just as a historical quirk, but as a fundamental theological difference. And finally, Section 5, Testing True Succession.
So, how should we evaluate historical claims of apostolic succession today? Well, the crucial point is this. A true apostolic witness doesn't just claim a name. It actually carries the apostolic reality. A valid chain absolutely has to preserve John's gospel center, prioritizing inward life over external performance and always keeping obedience as the fruit, never the root. The author concludes that if an office or a leader doesn't preserve this inward reality, well, the claim of succession is spiritually empty. Ultimately, the article's core thesis is that the true apostolic foundation is never Polycarp, it's never Ignatius, and it's certainly not a succession ladder. Rather, the true foundation is the living truth revealed in Christ. It's the Word of life manifested, the Son who gives life and the Spirit who makes alive. It's the new life given directly from God, not something mediated through a hierarchy. I want to leave you with this final, truly provocative question raised by our deep dive today. When you look at your own spiritual foundation, ask yourself, are you trusting in a chain of names, or are you trusting in the Word of life? It's a profound question that the article uses to challenge the very core of how we understand spiritual continuity. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.